More people are making things than ever before. But the thing we look back on when we look at a culture and we get a sense of cultural health, or we get a sense of, is culture progressing, we're looking for those differences, different styles, new ways of doing things, new values.
I'm Kate Brown, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. The first quarter of the 21st century is over. What just happened? A major strand of discussion, at least in the cultural sphere, has emerged about a pervasive sense of ennui, for one thing, a feeling that creative invention in culture has stagnated. W. David Marx's new book, Blank Space, A Cultural History of the 21st Century, is an incisive guide through the cultural touchstones that define the last quarter century. And he examines how commercialization came to dominate contemporary culture, propagated by technological advances and a changing cultural mindset. Marx argues that the rise of profit-driven formulas in various cultural industries paired with these technological shifts had a stemming effect on culture, causing the last 25 years to be some of the least innovative and the least transformative since the invention of the printing press. He has some ideas about how we can claw our way back to a society that champions cultural inventiveness. For those who don't already know, Marx is a Tokyo-based American culture and fashion writer whose work has appeared in The Atlantic and The New Yorker, among other publications. He's also the author of several books, including Status and Culture, How Our Desire for Social Rank Creates Taste, Identity, Art, Fashion, and Constant Change, and Ametora, How Japan Saved American Style. Hi, David. It's great to have you on.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. I just finished your book, which I really enjoyed. And I have to admit, at the top, I found myself stopping and starting it quite frequently because your storytelling got me very excited about so many songs, cultural figures, and reference points I'd forgotten about. Like I was listening to Grind In by Clips a few times on repeat.
Right. I mean, what's great about doing cultural histories today is that you can actually just go look up the songs that people mention or go watch the films or the TV shows. I remember reading Energy Flash by Simon Reynolds, which is like the cultural history of techno and electronic music in the late 90s. And every time he'd mention a song, it would just be like, that seems nice. And now, with YouTube, you could actually go and listen to every single one as you read along.
And I think that like frictionlessness of being able to look into archives maybe ties into some of the things we'll be talking about today. But, I'd like to start with just asking you, what prompted you to write a short history of the last 25 years effectively?
So it came out of two places. I mean, the first was my last book, Status and Culture, was about the general and universal principles of how culture forms out of the interaction of people, and really looking at that angle of social hierarchy as a driving engine for cultural change. And at the end of it, I examined the role of the internet in changing a lot of the parameters of how culture is made to solve this issue that people have been talking about, which is, why does culture feel like it's stagnating? And we can debate whether it is stagnating or we just feel like it. But that was a pretty short chapter, and I felt like there was a lot more to say about what's going on right now. And what I had noticed was that no one had really done a straight cultural history, and straight as in linear cultural history of the 21st century or the 2000s or the 2010s. And we were up to 2025, and there was really no stopping to say, okay, what were the 2000s like the way that we used to look at the 80s and the 90s? And so I felt like it was just a good time that maybe those 25 years felt like a blur, but we should at least stop and look at the major cultural changes that had happened. And I had been reading Chuck Klosterman's The 90s, and he had talked about grunge and selling out and some of these things that were very 90s. And he had mentioned Pearl Jam and reminded me that they stopped making music videos. And when I went back to think about that this band had gotten very big very quickly, and they decided, we're not going to make music videos, and they held to this promise for about 10 years. It just seems so alien to today's culture that the idea that you wouldn't just try to maximize how much money you make and how big you are and how popular you are. And so it felt like, okay, well, that's a pretty legitimate value shift that we've seen in the last 30 years. So there must be things we can chart in those 25 years, not just chronologically, like this happened and this happened, but really try to get to the root of what 21st century culture has been like. And so I had the opportunity to do this. I had to write it very quickly in 11 months, which I would not recommend to anybody trying to do a book like that in that short amount of time. And also because the election of 2024 was happening as I was writing it, I kind of didn't know how it would end until the election. And so the last part of the book kind of came together very quickly. But in general, I mean, what I feel like it's useful is to be something that explains how people felt about this 25 years right after it happened. But I look forward to future cultural histories that go back and understand it from a maybe a wider time angle and perspective. But this at least gives us a sense of writing down what we think is important at the moment.
Well, it's an ambitious undertaking given, as you mentioned, the timeline, but also this particular quarter century, to use the well-used quote, like the old world dying, the new one yet to be born, the time of monsters. I mean, it's been a very messy era. You fly over many culture industries, music in particular, but you also touch on art and fashion and the film industry. And, on the whole, we get the sense that there's more culture being produced, more content being produced than ever before, to say nothing of AI generated content, which we don't have time to touch on today. But on the human front, there are so many artists and cultural producers. So some would argue that we are in a more creative society that is more democratic. And yet, as you say, we have this feeling of cultural stagnation, and it's been a realm that art critics and culture critics have really been debating, especially in the last 5 years. So what is going on here? Like, we have more creative producers than ever before, and yet it feels like innovation is not happening.
Right. So when people say culture is dead, I think that's the wrong way to look at it and the wrong adjective or the wrong metaphor, because there's more cultural activity, as you said, than ever before. And there's more people creating culture than ever before. It's just simply that culture is mostly doing three things, which is that it's made for the purpose of entertainment and distraction. It is made for profit, for making people a lot of money, and it is made as a political tool. And so if you look at most of the culture made in the 21st century, it is more verging towards that. And the difference for the 20th century was that there were artists and subcultures and countercultures who were very focused on culture as an activity of difference, in the sense of that artists were going to create new ways of whatever their format was, whether it's, film or painting, that would expand the potential of that format and ultimately expand the human perspective and the human mind. Art, subcultures and countercultures are rejecting the conventional mainstream styles and sounds and making their own, and in order to kind of create their own community based around these different values. And so you had these people who were rejecting what was going on and really focusing on culture as the ultimate goal of their activity. And so I think what's happening now is you have lots and lots of people making things. There's no question of creativity is simply just the act of making something. More people are making things than ever before. But the thing we look back on when we look at a culture and we get a sense of cultural health, or we get a sense of, is culture progressing, we're looking for those differences, different styles, new ways of doing things, new values. And so if everyone's just kind of going out there and making culture that is political or to make money or just for entertainment distraction, it's very likely to be quite similar to culture in the past. And that means that things feel like they're stagnating because you don't have that sense of, wow, there's something truly new. It could be new in just the most basic superficial level, as it's not like the thing right before it, but it's not fundamentally different than what came before in the way that rock music was different than jazz or hip hop was different than rock. Trap music is probably a pretty good example of where things did radically change, that hip hop just sounds different than it did before. But for a lot of culture in the 21st century, it has not changed that much. And people really are also living in a way in which they're consuming things from now and before, and things from 10 years ago don't feel as alien as they would have in the 80s things during the 90s.
Yeah, so it's not really a crisis of overproduction as much as it's a crisis of values. And you touched on this with the Pearl Jam reference, this ethos of not wanting to sell out, which, as your book guides us through, you chart how that became increasingly okay, to the point that creativity and commerce are completely fused now. Can you speak a bit about how this happened? And, I'm curious how kitsch and nostalgia folds into that, because over the last 2 decades and a half, we have become increasingly nostalgic for past times. And there's been, the Stranger Things effect on all aspects of culture.
Yeah. So in terms of commerce and culture, if you go back to the 20th century and you think about the avant-garde mindset, that you have a vanguard of people who are creating new forms of art that radically disrupt the expectations of art that are in people's brains. And they know that they're not going to be popular by doing this because people want what they expect. And so there became an idea that obviously, if you're the most radical avant-garde artist, you're not going to be commercially successful because the market is based off of lowest common denominator tastes, et cetera, et cetera. And so there was always a distrust of the market and distrust of commerce if you were someone who cared a lot about artistic integrity and pushing art forward, or alternative music or indie music, or all these things. And there was a flip in the 21st century where it's not simply greed. And I think this is what's really important. It's not that we all got greedy and we only care about money. It's that there became a lot of suspicion around artistic excellence and artistic intention as a form of elitism, in the sense of, if you believe that there's a high culture and a low culture, and that high culture is better than low culture, then you are being very disrespectful to the people who can maybe not understand high culture and get a lot of value out of low culture and kitsch. And so kitsch is a word that's used in art theory not to mean bad art or lower quality art. It just means cultural products that conform to existing conventions, that conform to stock emotions and the way things that are always done. And so the difference between art and kitsch is that art was breaking those conventions and kitsch was conforming to them. But if you're now in a world in which we are worried about the inclusivity, if we start saying kitsch is not as valuable as art, then that one factor of what makes art and kitsch different, which is the invention versus convention side, becomes an irrelevant conversation. And so as we start not caring as much about that distinction, then obviously art that's made to be commercial, to appeal to the most people as possible, should be taken as seriously as art that's meant for a small audience or meant to be quite difficult. And so a lot of these barriers towards commerce were being eroded, not just from the market and not just from people who want to make a lot of money, but members of the cultural community themselves. I think that's been a really big shift that explains the open door to commerce. And then second is that open door to kitsch. And, nostalgia is also quite interesting because a lot of kids who are watching Stranger Things don't understand it from the perspective of nostalgia, in the sense they didn't grow up in the 80s playing Dungeons and Dragons and watching all these movies. But there's a general sense that the movies from the 80s, like a Star Wars or E.T., are iconic in a way that movies today are not. And so there's something about that era that Stranger Things portrays that's become crystallized even today as being more valuable than the cultural world that we live in. So Simon Reynolds talks about retromania. He has a book called that from 2011, one of the first people to really see what was going on in terms of culture being stuck. But I think the point is that we go back to these previous trends, not simply out of a sense of nostalgia that I grew up on it, I want to experience it again, but just that the culture of the past is more valuable than the culture of the present because of all these technological and economic and cultural factors. I know that I'm supposed to have one really easy answer in order to be on the lecture circuit and be endlessly quoted. But the problem is this is really, really complicated. And there are multiple factors kind of all playing together. And in the book, I try to tease them out and go through them. But in general, just the economy and technology and our cultural values have all shifted to focus on a certain worldview. And unfortunately, that makes the past look more attractive than the present.
Yeah, and you have a great quote, which is that kitsch never asks us to change. And I was thinking about that. And as you mentioned, nostalgia, it exists in a lot of contemporary art at the moment. You see homages to earlier artists, and they're often done under the auspices of critical revisions, which, are sometimes successful, but they are not inherently successful or inherently critical or inventive. So there is something interesting about the idea of a remix and that it's not always creating anything new at all. Now, you mentioned something about high culture and low culture just now, and you bring up this term cultural omnivorism in the book. And then maybe this is a way to get to the sort of first era, because of course you've broken up the last quarter century into 4 quarters. And from 2001 to 2008, you touch on this sort of advent of the cultural omnivore. Could you speak a bit about what this is?
Yeah, cultural omnivorism really starts in the 90s. It's a term from that era of sociologists, where it used to be that if you were in a certain socioeconomic class, especially towards the top, you would mostly be consuming high culture. And then there was middle brow culture and low culture. And so these were all class stratified. And what they noticed is that people in the upper middle classes or knowledge workers or creative class, whatever you want to call them, were proudly consuming low culture, and especially kind of pluralistic global low culture, ethnic foods and fun things from around the world, as much as they were consuming difficult art, difficult films. And so this became the idea of omnivorism, which is that you're going to consume high and low. And I think in general, this is a really positive thing, because if you're a cultural omnivore, it just means every day you wake up and you have more things to consume. You can value more things. You have more perspective. And it's also just generally more acceptance of how other people live. Like if you can understand great cuisine from all these different cultures, it's much more likely you understand that, your culture is not the only correct one and that there's other ways people can live. So it's, part of being a cosmopolitan liberal person to be a cultural omnivore. That then extends in the 21st century to a term that's a little bit controversial and people don't love it, but it's called poptimism. I think this is kind of the best way to describe it, which is to then say, okay, if there's really no difference between high and low, then we should treat pop music and manufactured pop and things that are really made for the market, not just commercialized in the market. We should treat them as seriously as we treat things that are made with artistic intent. And so if Ashley Simpson gets caught lip syncing, to disqualify her as being inauthentic is very unfair, because culture that's made from the market means that people sometimes need to have their voices repitched, or they need all these kind of studio tricks, and maybe they can't sing in live. So we should really treat all this pop culture as being as legitimate as non-pop culture. And from there, then you kind of just start getting some other ideas that are auxiliary to it, which is, well, if it's popular, it means more people like it, and therefore it's an even more legitimate form of culture than elitist high culture would be, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it's one of these kind of slippery slopes where omnivorism starts from the perspective of just, let's stop discriminating against people for their cultural taste and let's try to enjoy everything. And then poptimism is saying, let's really reinforce that at a critical level and make sure that we're giving critical attention to both things that are made to be sold and things that are made maybe for more artistic purposes. And then to the degree that it really moves to what I call ultra poptimism, where a lot of fans, let's say stans of Taylor Swift or Nicki Minaj, are really outraged when anybody criticizes their idol, because their idea is, if we love them, then you must respect the fact that we love them and recognize our tastes. And so any kind of cultural critique against popular artists is in some ways an anti-democratic move in itself. And so these ideas of inclusion really get played out in the 21st century and go in somewhat extreme directions. And at the moment, I mean, we certainly just do not live in a world in which there is any kind of hierarchy between high and low, and it's not a really useful way of looking at the world. And I think there's people who certainly will say the idea of a high and low culture is not great to start with. And I really loathe those terms personally, because high most definitely suggests that somebody who likes high culture is a better person than someone who likes low culture. But there is a difference between what art is doing and what kitsch is doing. And I think that has been lost in the wash as we think about this kind of question of omnivorism.
And then, of course, there were real political consequences to that, which you highlight in the book, that the kind of idea of counterculture arises again, but it arises on the right. But importantly, the right doesn't really create cultural innovation either. Can you get into that a little bit?
So I would say for most of the last couple centuries, the political right has not been a major source of artistic innovation. And there are some exceptions, maybe in the early 20th century, where you look at the Italian futurists and, Ezra Pound, and some of these people were supporters of fascism, and you can kind of argue narrowly that there was something going on there, or T.S. Eliot was quite conservative politically. But really, there was an idea in the avant-garde community that what artists were doing was expanding the potential of art. And in doing so, it expanded the potential of the human mind and opened the human mind. And that was a very liberal, progressive idea. And I think that art has been fundamental to pushing these cosmopolitan values, in the sense that if you understand that there's different ways that we can see the world, and there's different ways in which things can be created, which I think is one of the key goals of art, then you can understand how people feel around the world and how different cultures work, and understand and accept those cultures. And so I think in general, that creative invention has been mostly on the left for a very long time. And the right was just not that interested. And so much of conservatism was literally conservative in the idea of being a parochial culture of this is the way it used to be and it needs to be this way, or a provincial culture of the way that we live is the only right way and that everyone else is wrong. And so those are not conducive to artistic creation, and that they're not focused on it because they're focused on keeping things the way they are. When you get to the 21st century, so much of consumer culture had become about transgression. And that transgression was left-wing for a very long time because mainstream culture had a conservative core to it and had that parochial core to it. And once culture became more liberal and progressive, as in mainstream culture and mainstream politics, then the transgressive position began to be to fight against that and to think that things like political correctness is massively oppressive. And so you get first, let's say Gavin McInnes at Vice Magazine, who's using semi-ironically racial slurs or a lot of bigoted phrases in order to be provocative and outrageous. You see the same kind of thing on 4chan. And then that moves to what we see now with the manosphere, canceled people, and the kind of what Max Reed calls the Zinternet, which is like a vaguely right-wing conservative online community. But you get a sense that this is a slightly or extremely politically conservative side, but they're not interested in artistic innovation. That's just not what their goal is. And a lot of what they create is propaganda, or it's transgressive and it's against what they perceive to be the enemy, which is the kind of liberal nanny state or the liberal hegemony. So everything flipped, but the way that the 60s counterculture, you can go and look back and say, well, that was a massively creative couple of years in terms of aesthetics and music. I mean, the music of the counterculture sounds completely different than music that came before. I think you just can't point to this, what I call the counterculture, this right-wing counterculture, as being any kind of creative force. But I would argue that the conservatives, and this kind of conservative in particular, has never really done that in the past either.
One of the most persuasive parts of the book is where you bring poptimism, which you've just defined, into the realm of virtual platforms. And what happens there is that culture, you can really put metrics to it. And you sort of call this ultra poptimism. So that's something that in the art world, we have really experienced as well. We have so much data on what people are looking at, why they're looking at it. And it's had this feedback loop with creators, right? They're starting to feed into this process. Well, if I just tack this way, I'll get more visibility. And I'd like to talk to you about that a bit. What has metrics done to cultural invention? Because it seems like virality has created a real vacuum of invention.
Yeah, I mean, my perspective on art and culture is very much about not thinking about the cultural product as simply this thing that exists with intrinsic value. Like, this is a film and it's a good film, and this is a song and it's a good song. But really thinking about it in its entire context, and that context is also how other people think about it and what's come before and after it, and everything about that cultural artwork. And what's going on online, and we really can't escape, is that almost every piece of content we consume has some sort of numerical signal that's attached to it. And so obviously, if you're looking at a YouTube video, you're going to see how many views there are. And Spotify will give you a sense of how many listens or whether an artist is subscribed to. Substack does this too. So everything kind of has this. Twitter, X now has it where it actually gives you the view count for an actual tweet. But, you had before that likes and comments and retweets. Even if you don't want to follow these numbers, that you believe, I just like this video, I don't care how many people have seen it, it just infects our judgment. Think about it this way as a thought experiment. If someone were to send you, you got to see this video, and you opened it up and it had 48 views, you'd be like, why am I watching this? There's only 48 views for this video. And mostly what we expect, if someone says, you've got to watch this, it would have some high view count because it would be a sign that other people have seen the value in it. This is a good example of not where we want our values to shift in this direction, or that we're all out there saying, I only watch videos with 10,000 views. I've never met somebody who actually has this metric in their head, but we just absorb the logic of the platforms into how we make these judgments. And unfortunately, the context of these different artworks or cultural products or whatever you want to call them is within these platforms, and it's in that logic. And so it gets all sucked into it. So I think it's really difficult to, for example, be a young artist. And even if you're an artist with a lot of critical appraisal, or let's say only 20 people know your work, but it's the right 20 people, it's very hard to quantify that today in a way that you can show to somebody and say, this is why I'm important. And I think one of the things about the 20th century is it's not that it was unquantified, and there were still, measures. It's just that it was imperfectly quantified. So you can always imagine that something that was very good but unpopular was popular with the right people, or it had some sort of other intangible metric to it that made you still believe it's important. But I think the problem with the platforms today is they just lay bare everything in front of you so that you really know, is this being watched? Is this popular? Do people like it?
Yeah, I feel like at one point Meta's Instagram briefly pulled away likes, like they A/B tested hiding likes.
Yes.
There's a marked difference, I guess, between art and other cultural industries because you can't really put a cap on the prices. And so I think that this whole virality logic that you just described and how it's tied in with success and also commercial success, it has this wild upward spiral that seems kind of topless. What are your observations of the art world in particular, and how some of these issues that you've identified in this book maybe even are more exacerbated?
For me, the most important way to look at art is the institutional theory of art, that, art is its institution, and the value of any art is made in that institution. And one of the things I've been thinking about quite a lot is, what does it mean and what happens when that institution is corrupt? If the institution from, top to bottom is corrupt, or its entire value system or its entire function on a global level is all about money from different perspectives. And that could be money for signaling, it could be money for money laundering, it could be commercial transaction, whatever it is. But if the entire institution is mobilized around money and only money, and the amount of money being poured into it is exponentially higher than ever before, it's going to change the entire valuation system. And so it's a difficult time for art. And the thing that I'm optimistic about always is just, I believe there are great artists out there. The question is there a structural and institutional problem with these great artists not having impact on the world and influence on the world because they're just not the right artists to fulfill the other financial functions that are required? So there's a great book called Emergence of Style that the FIT professor Natasha Degen did, which is about art after Warhol. And she really traces this, but she made a really smart conclusion about how much the luxury brands are now supporting art as well. And if you're a company that makes bags and you also have an art museum, it's very likely that you're going to champion the artists who you can take their art and put the motif of that artist on the handbags. And so you're not going to support an artist that it's very difficult because, let's say, they don't have a gimmick, they don't have a motif, they put it on the handbags. That's a good example of just, again, if the institution itself is corrupted or it's moving for things other than artistic progression or artistic invention, then obviously it's just going to push art in the ways that serves it. And I think that's what you see, and it's difficult. And I don't know what the solution is to it other than, for many times in history, the artistic institution has become rotten. And if you go back and look at the frustration of artists like Manet and Monet and the Impressionists and how much they hated the Academy, and they had their own shows and they had their own world, and they really kickstarted their own valuation. I mean, they were, from one perspective, just outsiders and losers and made horrible art that people did not like. And they worked very hard to shift everything to the degree that we remember them and we don't remember the people that came before them. And so if I was a young artist, the main thing to say is that if you feel frustration about the rottenness of the system, then you need to follow the people that came before you who turned that frustration into leveling the whole system and creating your own valuation system, which then serves you in the future. And that's how art works.
I was just thinking about, how it's important but very difficult to de-incentivize art that fits into marketing language readily, and I think that the whole idea of art, and you just did a great job of describing it, is it's about making a new language. It's about saying things that have not been said. And by that effect, they're not necessarily going to be easy to speak about or describe. And that's the whole challenge. And that's full of friction, but that doesn't quite work in the attention economy that we have right now. You know, Critics might call on your subjectivity, saying that we all tend to find that culture has peaked already.
Yep.
It peaked when we were younger. And this is an argument that, was levied in a few cases against the art critic Dean Kissick, who wrote this much discussed article, which I'm sure you read in Harper's, called The Painted Protest. What is your reply to that criticism that, you might be being nostalgic for a time that's passed?
For me, the main point of the book is not to say, here's all this good culture and here's all this bad culture and everything's bad now. It's to get at the root of what are the cultural values that are driving the creation of that culture. And so I would love to see somebody try to do a cultural history of the last 25 years to say this is the best 25 years of culture that we've ever experienced. I think that would be more roundly criticized than me saying the opposite. It's not that the Strokes weren't as good as Nirvana or something. That's just not that important to me. And there's so much 21st century culture that I've enjoyed and loved. It's simply that I think there's some really objective signs where you say something different is going on. And, the most obvious ones are just the proliferation of sequels and the fact that, artists like Taylor Swift and Beyonce have been dominant for so long, almost 20 years, in a way that you just don't see those patterns in the late 20th century. So I think there's signs that you can point to. But I guess at the end of the day, this is really where the debate is. Can you make a case that a Taylor Swift compared to a Madonna or a Bob Dylan or any of these 20th century artists, that she cares as much about artistic invention? It used to be the standard. It's not to say these were better people in the 20th century, but they were just more noble, and that's what they cared about. It was just what the expectation on Madonna was, that every album or every single had to be more sensational than the last, or do something different, or try to commune with cutting edge sounds or cutting edge communities or underground things around the world. That was the expectation on her that she had from her particular background, and that's just absent from Taylor Swift. And so it's not a question of, is Taylor Swift good or not? Because obviously she makes music that people around the world love. And I'm not a fan of Taylor Swift, but when I listen to Taylor Swift, I believe it is pleasant music that it doesn't bother listening to it. I understand why people like it. But the question is, if Taylor Swift is the most representative artist of our time, and I think that she has claims to that, or at least it's a top 5, is she using that platform? Has she used that platform to move the format and the artistic medium that she engages in, which is music, forward in a way that opens the medium itself to open the door to more people to play with those inventions and changes the way that we engage with music, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just easy to look at the 20th century and find lots of artists who did that. And maybe that's too much to put on Taylor Swift, but it's simply to look at what the structural effects and the values that this art carries is. And so because this 25-year period corresponds to my adulthood, it is very easy just to do this critique of me that, yeah, it's just you got old and you don't like anything anymore. But again, it's the Stranger Things effect, which is if people are looking to the past and saying, that looks a lot cooler, I wish I lived in that world instead of this one, that is another sign that people who don't have that nostalgia effect, adults, I hate everything effect, end up somehow coming to the same conclusions that something is wrong with our era. And so there's at least enough objective measures to argue this. And for me, I felt like I was the right person to write this book in that I experienced these 25 years as an adult and paid attention to it. I think if you're a little older, you would have missed some of the new things. And if you're somewhat younger, you would have not, been around for 9/11 and those things. But I would love to hear younger people really defend what's going on. And if they believe that TikTok is as innovative as the early 20th century novel, go for it. I would be the first person to read that.
Yeah, which you were just saying about the continuity of Beyonce and Taylor Swift. I mean, it doesn't as tidily compare to the art industry, but the leaderboard of art forms that get the most commercial success have been very stagnant, not to say nothing of the particular names. And so, there is a real call to action to bring about new forms. And your book ends in this space, and you have some ideas about how to get out of this, what I might term a cultural rut, where artistry is really tied up in entertainment, politics, and commerce. So, what are these? And are you seeing signs that this is already happening?
So I give more or less 5 solutions to the problem. I spend 300 pages talking about these massive structural reasons for our value shifts. And so it seems very naive and a little misguided. Just say, here's 5 ways to fix it. Great, here we go. But for me, the most important thing is that culture can be changed by a very small group of people. And that is different than the economy, and it's different than politics. You don't have to mobilize everybody. We don't need every single person to start having better taste or caring about art in order to change the culture. It can always happen on the fringes with very small marginal groups, and that's the way it's worked in the past. And so all you need is the people who really care about culture to understand the role that they play in the ecosystem, to think about culture as an ecosystem, to understand what they're doing, to go off and stop being incentivized by these bad incentives, and instead really focus on artistic invention as a social good, to understand that what they're doing by pursuing the highest forms of artistic invention, that they're adding something to society. And we have to mobilize around that. We need critics to really appreciate that and not just focus on popular people anymore. And we've got to move away from thinking about data as a solution of, I'm going to look at the data, I'm going to know what to make. Because it's also very clear that the history of culture, that the people who did not look at data and did not understand what people wanted at that moment, but tried to foresee what they would want, those are the people that have changed culture. And they're the ones we remember today. All I'm saying is we've been on autopilot for 25 years. These structures have pushed us in a certain direction. Can we take a moment to say, is this the direction we really want to go? And if it's not, if we really care about creative invention as a social good, we should stop and readjust our values. And the thing about values is that they're free, and you have values and you can change them, and you can start living in a different way to conform to those values and those things you care about. And so if anything, even if people don't agree with the book or don't agree with my conclusions, if they get to the end of the book and they want to fiercely argue that creative invention is important, but it's happening and I'm just not seeing it, then that's great. I really want everyone who has the potential to care about this issue to care about it. And I think that will in itself hopefully lead to some positive change.
Thanks so much, David. It's been great to chat with you. And I just want to point everyone to your newsletter, Culture and Owner's Manual, which covers pop culture and its hidden mechanics. And there are several links to your books on that website.
Thanks so much.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Menalili with contributions from myself, Ben Davis, Carolyn Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.